Hey everyone, in this video we'll be taking a look at a few failed state mergers, or unification movements, throughout history. One state merger that got all the way to a referendum in 2004 was the reunification of Cyprus. Cyprus had gotten its independence from the UK in 1960, but only 14 years later, Turkey invaded the island, mainly because of its strategic importance, as well as to avoid Cyprus joining Greece, which was a very real possibility given the Greek majority on the island. There was also a Turkish minority living throughout the island, a remnant of the centuries of Ottoman rule there. This also stirred up nationalistic sentiment in Turkey and was a great motivator for the invasion. Following the invasion and ceasefire, Turkey set up the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus we know today in the northern part of the island. And following this, many Turks from the mainland began moving in and settling in northern Cyprus illegally under international law. This will be important later. Decades after this, in 2004, just before Cyprus was joining the European Union, the two communities were asked to hold a referendum on a reunification proposal where Cyprus would become one unified Greco-Turkish state, with no affiliation with Turkey nor Greece. While it was approved by 65% of Turkish Cypriots, it was rejected by 78% of Greek Cypriots. The main reason for this was that there were a lot of controversies surrounding the referendum. Greek Cypriots disputed the right of the earlier mentioned Turkish Cypriots who had immigrated from Turkey since 1974 to participate in the election. While they were a small minority group and would not have changed the vote in any significant way, the main concern for many Greek Cypriots was that if the technically illegal Turkish settlers that arrived in more recent times were allowed to participate in such a referendum, they would obviously also be allowed to stay, something which the Greek Cypriots were very opposed to, as they saw it as a deliberate attempt at making Cyprus more culturally Turkish. Another concern was the possibility for a permanent flow of settlers from Turkey, and this is why the referendum failed, keeping the status quo with a UN buffer zone dividing the island. Of course, this state merger failing does not mean the movement is completely dead. There are still many Cypriots that want reunification, but it is a precarious situation as neither side want the islands to be dominated by the other. The Federation of Arab Republics was an attempt by Muammar Gaddafi to create an Arab state in the 70s. The project saw some initial success, with a referendum on unification passing in Libya, Egypt, and Syria by overwhelming margins, as over 90% were pro-unification in all three countries. This proposal, along with many others, were generally a part of a larger pan-Arab ideology that was on the rise at the time, which promoted Arab cooperation and Arab unity. The Federation technically existed for 5 years, from 1972 to 1977. Sudan and Iraq were also invited to join the Federation, as the goal was to create a pan-Arab state that included all nations with significant Arab populations. But the Federation fell apart during the 5 years where Libya, Egypt, and Syria were in the process of unifying, as the three countries disagreed on the specific terms of the merger. Another merger in the Middle East attempted by Muammar Gaddafi in the 70s was the Arab Islamic Republic. It was a proposed merger of Libya and Tunisia into a single country or confederation, and a part of the larger Arab unification movement mentioned before. It mainly failed due to disagreements between Gaddafi and the Tunisian president Habib Bourguiba. Bourguiba was under the impression that the two countries' borders would remain and that it would be more of a loose union, whereas Gaddafi wanted to completely merge the two countries into one, perhaps as a single member of a larger Arab federation if that project were to succeed as well. The Intermorium was a geopolitical project that arose several times in the successor states of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. One of the more notable renditions of the proposal was Józef Piłsudski's plan. His plan was to resurrect an updated democratic form of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while working for the disintegration of the Russian Empire and later Soviet Union into its various ethnic constituents, allowing for Belarus and Ukraine to join Poland and Lithuania in a democratic union. Piłsudski saw an Intermorium federation as a counterweight to both Russian and German imperialism. But around the same time of the Polish-Soviet War, Piłsudski did recognize that his plan was simply not feasible, mainly due to the Soviets' grip over Ukraine and Belarus. In the aftermath of the war, with Ukraine and Belarus firmly under Soviet control, Piłsudski revised the plan to be more of a federation or perhaps alliance of countries in between Germany and the Soviet Union, expanding Intermorium beyond just Poland and Lithuania, but including the rest of the Baltics, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and the Nordic countries. Two major roadblocks for this plan was that the Lithuanian and Czechoslovakian governments were distrusting of Poland. And while Poland had pretty good relations with the rest of the countries, many of them, particularly Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania, had tensions with their neighbors. This made it virtually impossible to create any sort of union or alliance, as not all members had good relations with one another. The only accomplishments that really came from the Intermorium concept were two separate alliances, namely the Little Entente between Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, as well as the separate Polish-Romanian alliance. So in the end, the Intermorium plan died with Piłsudski in 1935. A perhaps not very widely known proposed merger was one between the United Kingdom and Malta. Malta was at the time already a British colony, but in 1956 they held the Maltese United Kingdom's integrations referendum, which would make it more of an integral part of the United Kingdom, with its own seat in the British House of Commons. In this proposal, the UK Parliament would have control of defence, foreign affairs, and direct taxation, whereas the Maltese Parliament would be responsible for all other areas of public life, including education and the position of the Catholic Church. The main selling point was that the standards of living on the islands could be raised to that of the rest of the UK by raising wages and increasing employment opportunities. The referendum actually passed with almost 68% of votes being for the integration, but the plan failed to come to fruition because of several controversies surrounding the referendum. The results were ultimately deemed inconclusive as the Catholic Church and opposition parties called for a boycott, resulting in a turnout of only 59%. The other major issue was that talks between the Maltese Prime Minister and the UK broke down due to matters of finance, and that the UK concluded that Malta was no longer of strategic importance, meaning it would be less willing to prop up Malta economically. Another interesting and lesser-known unification movement was the Balkan Federation project. It was a very optimistic left-wing political movement to create a country in the Balkans combining Yugoslavia, Albania, Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania. The project emerged in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the vision was to leave behind nationalistic sentiment by overcoming the differences among the countless ethnic groups in the region and creating a common federal republic that would promote internationalism, multiculturalism, socialism, and economic equality. The movement essentially went through three phases, the last of which would put a complete end to any serious move towards unification. The first phase was the rise of the movement as a result of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The second phase was the interwar period, where the movement became more of a left-wing vision as the socialist and communist parties in the Balkan countries took up the idea. The third phase was right after World War II, where there were several clashes between Balkan communist leaders. But what was most detrimental to the movement was that Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, opposed the idea, probably to keep the region weaker, divided, and more thoroughly under Soviet influence. A probably even lesser-known unification movement was the United States of Latin Africa. It was a proposed union in the mostly Catholic and Romance language-speaking countries in Central Africa, envisioned by Barthélemy Boganda in the 1950s. Other than the country's common religious and Romance language ties, the main idea behind unification was to create a powerful counterweight to the British-influenced bloc in southern Africa. The movement died out with Barthélemy Boganda, however, as he died in a plane crash in 1959. But it was a part of larger Pan-African movements that arose at the time as the European powers were leaving Africa, and other Pan-African movements have lived on till this day. The African Union, for instance, was established in 2002, and today promotes cooperation within the massive and diverse continent that is Africa. But that's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more content like this in the future. See you guys next time.